we'll start. You're live. Okay. Yeah, so it's my pleasure to welcome you at Depot today, who's been a long-time partner for Crit Cross. We're now at number 20, so it's the 20th Crit Cross we're holding. And we, is Verein K, Dejan Kalujerovic, Jelena Kalujerovic, and I founded the Verein to, well, among other things, have more critical discourse around criticism in Vienna, also to bring critics, international critics here and international curators. So we have 3 programs, and Crit Cross is really the program for the people who are in Vienna. As time went by, we've developed more and more topics. So in the beginning, we always just read recent texts, and your text happens to be among the first texts we read in the very first Crit Cross, when we were still at the Mumok Bibliothek. Welcome also to the people in the live stream. So it's live streamed. So if you're gonna participate in the discussion, you have to know that it's recorded unless you don't take the microphone. Okay, that's a formal thing I need to say at this point. And yeah, so we did it at the Mumok Bibliothek, and you had just written a text about the Heidi Hotten exhibition, the Wow, at the Leopold Museum, a very critical kind of investigative text around these big exhibitions. And now Heidi Hotten, of course, has a museum here in Vienna and has passed away since then. And we found it really interesting to start not only with a text that engages with art in the sense of I look at art and I say something intelligent about it, but also looks at the context, looks at the institutional context and how these contexts serve to create market value. And you made very interesting arguments. So it took us 20 Crit Crosses to have you in person. But here you are, Nina Schedlmayer, who's writing for different outlets. This text was in Profil, but now you're also the head of a journal, and you founded Artemisia, a feminist blog with a wide reach. I once talked about it to people in Switzerland. I said, yeah, there's this blog, and they said, oh yeah, we know it. Yeah, so apparently you have quite a wide reach with this blog, and this was like the most obvious kind of signal on your part to say, okay, Nina is really someone we should invite on the topic of feminist critique, or criticism, even though I think you've done it also in other texts before, and also written a book, which you also told me was part of that. So maybe we can talk a little bit about these different steps in your path to criticism from a feminist perspective, or feminist criticism. Rosalyn D'Mello, I met in Salzburg a few years ago when I was teaching at the Summer Academy, and there was a book presentation around, what was it called? Navigating the Planetary?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Navigating the Planetary, and Rosalyn had written a beautiful text for that book and gave a talk in which, among other things, she memorably said that she thinks that the time for big metal sculptures is over. And I was like, what a great thing to say. And I agree very much, even though I had never thought of it before. And the great metal sculpture also tends to be a very masculine gesture, to put, these big metal pieces out there. And I would even include Richard Serra, even though his sculptures are abstract and are not these big monuments for great men in bronze for eternity, in this kind of domain. And we started talking afterwards and have been in touch ever since, and had the opportunity to already invite you once to speak about your approach to criticism, for which you have coined a term, which can you remind me of the term?
Metabolic art criticism.
Metabolic art criticism, that you can talk a little bit about as well, maybe here. And Rosalyn writes a feminist column for a newspaper. Is that a weekly column?
Yeah, it's a weekly. Mm.
Yes, and also writes for Steer World, which I was happy to discover through your writing, where you write about art. But of course, there's also often a kind of feminist and also very personal perspective. And when I was looking at both of your work, I kind of, and I wrote it in the announcement a little bit, I felt that, Nina is often also relying on numbers, and it's like, okay, I'm going to make these objective analysis and base my claims on them. And you go very deep into personal events as well and talk about your personal history, encounters in the art world and so on. And I found these were two kind of sides of maybe the same coin of engaging with feminist issues in art and in the art world. So that's kind of my little introduction to the two of you, and maybe you can talk a little bit how this developed, and did you already from the outset when you studied have a kind of feminist perspective of the world, or is that a sensibility that developed? In one of your texts, Rosalyn, it was a museum visit from a brown-eyed perspective. You say that you meet an ex-lover and he says, oh, you've become so political since we last met. So I felt that maybe it was something that developed over time, but I would be curious to both of you, how that developed. Anyone wants to start?
I would ask Nina to go first.
Yes.
Because I'm like dying to hear.
Okay, super.
Okay, so I think feminism, in my case, started at the age of maybe 15 when I discovered that my brother and me were kind of treated in a different way. And during my studies in Vienna, it was in the 90s, I studied art history. And actually, female artists did not really exist. So I remember talk with the professor I wrote my master thesis at, which was about Hannah Höch, Dadaist from Berlin, and her view on techniques and mechanics in her work. And I talked to him, and he said about women in the avant-garde, and he said, surrealism, I think there were no female surrealists. And that was the state of knowledge in the 90s here in Vienna. So, and I was wondering, because media were completely different. It was so difficult to get more information about things like that. Actually, for a second, I maybe really believed that there are no female surrealists. And so I always had this kind of I'm a bit kind of I have a kind of feminist fundament, so feminist basis. It's always somewhere, in my mind. So
Feminist intuition. Let's go.
And, so that's it basically, because then you just had to open the eyes. You just have to open the eyes to see the inequality also in the art world. It's not such a big thing. So
it's not so invisible.
It's there, and I thought you should. It would be good to do something against that. And it's also, for a journalistic approach and for a critical approach, it's actually nice, because it's not easy. It's not so difficult to criticize this. And one of the main issues in journalism is the conflict, and here is it, the conflict. There are still not enough women in the museums, on the art market, etc., etc. So,
When I want to zoom in a little bit, if you allow me, on this moment where you said with 15, I saw all my brothers treated differently.
Yeah.
What were the kind of key moments in that, or the typical things that you observed?
Yeah, it's just, I mean, growing up on the countryside in Austria, yeah, I mean, we had, yeah, of course, me as a girl had to help cooking. My brother didn't have to do that. So, I mean, it was, yeah, it was the regular way actually to grow up there in this way. So I don't think my family is extraordinary, traditional. It was just the society like that. So it was not so difficult to get this kind of consciousness.
And in terms of studying, was that like something where your brother was more or less encouraged to study or to do a matura? Or
no,
was that,
it was no, absolutely not. It was very important for my family that children get higher education if possible. So that, I mean, it was 90s, it was not 60s or 50s. So yeah. So, and they really encouraged me to do everything I wanted. So I don't want to bash my parents because they were really good to me. But I mean, everywhere, I think most people, most girls grew up in this kind of tradition and dichotomy.
Mm-hmm. And after this Hannah Höch episode, were you like, okay, I'm gonna go look for these feminist surrealists, or what was your impulse then, or when did this impulse start to say?
Actually I think it was actually later, because maybe it was not so easy to learn about all this stuff. And I mean, of course, there has been lots of research, but it was always been a part of my life. But actually, at the moment, the recent 5 years is this time in my life I'm most I'm most involved into this art and feminism thing, because I'm writing the blog and I have the feeling that I always have to write another article and another one and another one, because there's so much going on. So my focus on that is really much higher at the moment than before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this first story.
I know it's very personal.
No, that's great. I think it should be. And Rosalyn, do you want to tell us also a little bit about your kind of path into this sensitivity, or what you call the feminist intuition yourself?
Yeah, I like saying feminist intuition because it's like a reminder that there's always this discomfort that many of us who had gendered upbringings or lived in gendered societies, you always felt this discomfort, like something is wrong, something's not quite it, but you don't always have the vocabulary to frame it and to pin it down and say, this is what it is, or this is patriarchy in action, because nobody teaches you these words. So I think a lot of my feminism is really self-taught, but a lot of it also comes from living in big cities, growing up in Mumbai and then living in New Delhi, both really intense cities in very different ways. And when I grew up in Mumbai, actually, Mumbai was a city that didn't necessarily encourage a political consciousness in your undergrad education. You don't actually have student unions. It's almost, I think it's even banned. So I didn't have a very I didn't have a very overtly political upbringing in that sense. However, I did study English literature and as well as psychology and history. And I think that was my formal introduction to through that, I had a formal introduction to feminism. For me, one of the groundbreaking moments was reading Ellen Sixou's text, The Laugh of the Medusa. It really changed something in me. And then being introduced to feminists from India, like women writers like Kamla Das. And then I moved to Delhi, and I was in a university that had a very political climate. And that's where that was the reference that lover makes, that when I had met him in the university, he's Swedish. I was not political in that I did not participate in any of the either left or right political discourse, because I think none of them appealed to me in terms of intersectional feminism. They were all looking at single issues, or they were looking at issues through the lens of class or right wing, left wing. And I think I was more like, but none of this actually encompasses the heart of the matter, which is patriarchy and how that intersects with capitalism and class and caste. And I really felt like that was not represented so much in the university I was in. And it was later, after I left university and I started working with a feminist publishing house in New Delhi, that I think my feminist consciousness got even more nurtured. And I had the opportunity to work with incredible female authors. And with one of the leading feminists in India, Urvashi Bhuttalia. So I think that kind of first-hand experience was really nourishing. And I think ever since then, it's just been growing and growing. And it was hard to kind of find a way to synthesize the feminist philosophy within practice, to really be like, okay, my practice is a feminist practice, and to kind of really start to ground that in and maintain that. And because the moment you start to do that, you start to make enemies, you start to upset people in power. You're already perceived as like against the establishment, so you become fringe, and you have to arrive at the space where you then embrace the fringe and be like, okay, I'm happy to be here, and to have this distance and to say what I have to say with conviction, rather than to get into this kind of people pleasing art criticism, which I started to feel in India. That remains the bulk of art criticism today. It's people pleasing, it's patting each other on the back. And I think with me, every column that I started to write that really defined my voice was one that pissed people off, and I wasn't interested in pleasing people. I wasn't interested in being patted on the back. I think the more I pissed people off, the happier I became, because I felt like, okay, this is clearly hitting a nerve, So I wouldn't say that I don't know if it's easy to say that, oh, it changed anything, but I think it helped me to kind of be more assertive about what I wanted my practice to be and how to define that.
Thank you very much. And many things that I kind of noticed and find interesting. But maybe the question of hostility is something I want to zoom in on first. Did you experience hostilities in doing this? So you mentioned the fact of pissing people off. How is it in your case, Nina? Do you get explicit, implicit? Is there people who don't invite you anymore, don't talk to you, or do people mostly not dare? Are they too afraid to say if they disagree?
No, I mean, of course, some people don't like what I'm writing about, and some people complain, or somebody once told me that the editor of the cultural affairs resort in a daily paper in Austria said he doesn't like me so much because I'm too feminist, which is a compliment for me.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, every time when you when you say, no idea, I mean, female artists are underrated, you will get into some conflict with somebody. But I mean, for me, actually, here in Vienna, or at least in the German-speaking countries, most people who are who are giving me a response are doing so in a positive way, because yeah, many people say, okay, now somebody tells what's going on. But I mean, and the other thing is that actually in many cases I'm criticizing big institutions. And
so for instance, you spoke about the Baselitz exhibition.
Yeah, things like that. And I mean, people who are there in charge, like the directors, I mean, they are actually too, I think, distanced and professional to kind of be hostile in this way. But yeah, of course, then, yeah. But I mean, yeah, I remember somebody once calling me hashtag feminist because I was criticizing a very low percentage of women in an exhibition, and like a primitive hashtag feminist and so on. But I mean, to me, yeah, if there is somebody attacks me in this way, welcome. I'm willing to fight. Don't worry. I mean, it's all very. I mean, I'm a journalist, and female journalists who are working in other fields, for example, in politics. I mean, they are confronted with so much hate speech and so on. So the cultural affairs is really, really relaxed.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, in art, I mean, I have this experience as well, that in art people are rather nice, at least here. But we once had a discussion with 2 English art critics, and it got really bad. Much more angry because of whole cancel culture potential and so on. And so yeah, but I have a feeling that I can relate to that fact. And when the discussions happen, do they happen under your Facebook post, on a new post?
Yeah,
or yes,
sometimes things like that. But I mean,
I've seen a few, I think.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, it's good to have discussion and discourse. So actually, I don't really, I mean, I'm not really feared by things like that. So if you, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Or but it's not really heat. It's more like it's not really like heat. So in my case, but
how about you? I mean,
I'm more interested in what Rosalyn has to tell.
I mean, you also mentioned, the class, caste, patriarchy, and for me, of course, caste is not a term we would naturally use that much. It's like, oh yeah, maybe that's also something, how was the Indian context maybe also you in that sense, because you spoke of the upbringing in the Austrian countryside. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about?
I think in India, the caste is something that's constantly swept under the carpet, because people in like liberal art circles don't necessarily want to talk about it or address it, because it's such a potent topic, and everyone wants to pretend that it's over and it's not an issue because we have reservations. But if you really look at the Indian art world, it's full of upper caste. I mean, it's essentially run by upper caste, highly privileged people. All the galleries are run by people who come from generational wealth or who have made it big, or who are using the art world to kind of elevate their status and their profile. And especially if you look at what's currently underway in India in terms of the political climate, you really see that there is starting to be this collision between the established art world and the ruling government, and this kind of unspoken and even spoken and overt kind of uh, getting along, which is a bit surprising and alarming. So there is a very clear sense of gatekeeping. There is a lot of gatekeeping in the Indian art world, and it's really it's also very toxic in many ways. And when I say toxic, I mean it's really toxic. I think many people from my generation who I knew over the last 10-15 years in the art space, many of them just left because they couldn't stand how toxic it was. So it wasn't about like, oh, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. It was like, this kitchen is basically running on toxic fumes, and if you stay there, you are going to like inhale this and die. So for many people, it was a question of survival, and that's another form of gatekeeping. So I would say even when I started out as an art critic in India, I was not shown the red carpet. I think people said things like, okay, who is this idiot? Especially because I didn't have an art history background. I had an English literature background. I come from minority in India. So there was certain ways in which I was perceived as well. And it really took a lot to kind of keep all that noise out of my head and to continue doing what I was doing, and to just believe that I had focus and I had a path, and to kind of persist. Having said all of that, right now being in South Tyrol, there are days when I feel really lonely. There are many days when I feel really alienated. But amid all of that, I keep reminding myself of how toxic it got, especially during the height of the Me Too movement in India, when so many of us were really edged out from collective discourse, because we were being so vocal about how institutions were suppressing, or how institutions were protecting abusers, how institutions themselves were abusive or nurturing toxic environments. So it got really bad. And I have to say, when I moved here in the midst of the pandemic, and then I couldn't go back to India for 3 years. I recently went like in April for like a week and a half. And I was just glad not to be at a single art event or to visit a gallery, because I just don't feel like, I feel quite exiled from that world. And it's a combination of exile and self-exile. So for me, it's a lot more, the stakes were always very high. And I don't regret anything that I did I don't regret being vocal. I don't regret writing about the ways in which institutions failed so many women, or writing about how casteist many of these systems were. I'm quite proud of that, the fact that I stood on that side of it, and I didn't like give in, or I didn't allow myself to be silenced. And now when I'm over here in Europe, I guess I see my role differently, because now I guess I'm coming up constantly against the whiteness of the art world over here, and the whiteness of institutions, and frequently being the only person of color in a certain room or in a certain context, and kind of trying to make sense of that, and also being edged out of certain spaces because of that, or sometimes being invited to spaces as a kind of token person of color, so I'm kind of negotiating all of that while trying to earn a living, and in a bilingual context where I don't really know either of the languages. so well. So it's a very different, and I think my monthly columns for Stir, which is at the moment the only regular art criticism that I do, but I do it regularly. Like every month I have a column out, and I've been doing it since 2 years. I think that really gives me the space to kind of explore ideas and to kind of be critical. And I don't get paid a lot, but I don't do it anymore for money. I try to earn money through other means. I always did. And I think that's how I'm kind of continuing to be critical and maintain a feminist, intersectional approach to it all.
What's your column about? What exactly are you writing about there?
So my Stir column initially began because the art editor, then an artist, Rahul, who's no longer the art editor, he wanted somebody to write critically about the art world and to not like be afraid to have an opinion, which many people are, because I guess the art criticism market is so devalued that people have to earn money by, writing catalog essays, etc. So you have to be nice to the gallerists and the people who have money, which goes against, the dictum of art criticism if you're not like fully employed. So for me, it was a really great way to kind of start thinking around having a very boldly feminist approach. And so much of my columns actually were about looking at broadening what we imagine to be feminist art or even women's art. So I started talking about knitting, about crochet, about embroidery. I have written columns about how a particular kind of gesture that you do in the kitchen is a form of citation. You're citing your great grandmother, and how these things come down to you. And maybe this is a form of oral citation, in this like really bodily way. I did one entire piece, for example, on a cookbook. It's actually an Austrian feminists cookbook. It's called Kochbuch keine Hausfrau, I think. And I did an entire piece on that. For example, I recently did a piece on the Sankt Fale show in Schirn. So I very consciously don't look at male art, or if I do, I really start to critique it. Like, for example, I was in Parma in Italy on a day trip, and there I saw a very problematic monument, which was celebrating the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. So I started to dig a little bit and find out what this monument was. Why is it still there? And is there any discourse happening around it? So that was one column that I did. So yeah, some of the columns are about, many of them are around issues that pertain to the global south, or what we call I try not to use that term global south, but it's just a kind of convenient term. I use the space of a column so because I can blend memory, and kind of build from personal experience and kind of, constantly bridge this personal, political, structural, these threads together. And also in order to make it accessible to people, I don't want people to feel like, oh, they need to have read art history in order to understand what I'm writing about, So my columns are actually very anecdotal, or I think they're very readable. I don't even think, oh my God, I want to sound a certain way, or, it's more like, let's talk about pattern and decoration, for example. And so that's a huge part of my columns for Stir are focused on some of these areas.
It sounds really interesting. Hopefully once you will edit them in a book one day, so I can
find it. Yeah, I mean, they're all available right now in a vertical, but yeah, I do think, yeah, some of them actually I have put together in a kind of book, because I was working on a project that I called In the Name of the Mother, when I was at my fellowship last year in Kunstlerhaus Büchsenhausen, in Innsbruck. And my study was around motherhood, but it was also about, the mother as in like how do you call it, a mutter, that you use for fermentation. um that so the thing that leads to another thing, that leads to another thing, that leads to another thing, from which you can sort of generate discourse. And I was so tired of hearing this word seminal, all the time in English art criticism. Is seminal literally means of or relating to semen, and it's the idea that anything that is valid or has significance can only come from a male body. It's so problematic to me as an idea, and I try never to use this word in my writing. And I was trying to think of what could be a word that could counter this seminality. And so I started thinking about the word umbilical, like the umbilical cord, which is kind of cut off, but it's always there as this depression in your tummy. And so how, so I started thinking about like the metaphor of mother, motherhood, because I was pregnant at the time, but also like matrilineal artistic legacies, for instance, like how certain artists learn things from their mother, even though that their mothers were not artists, but like embroidery or knitting or cooking practices, which they then, kind of, so these, I call them matrilineally inherited artistic legacies. So I was kind of going in search of these. So it's like, if you're telling me that, okay, there were no famous women painters, what were women doing? If they were in the kitchen, what were they cooking? What were they talking about? Was that discourse? So those are some of the questions that I was kind of trying to ask. So I was also looking at the work of like mystics, female mystics, trying to understand witchcraft and how that also fed into, artistic practices and stuff like that. It was like this idea of performing speculative discourse. So if you're telling me that, okay, these histories don't exist, like how can we speculate our way around them?
So in a way, following up on that, and I've been struck by, of course, the fact that, in this art critical column, you write about a cookbook or you write about these practices. Are you saying these are interesting practices, or are you saying, no, we should claim that they are art? How does it, or is that not even a question that you are interested in?
For me, it's not even because I just feel like historically, if you think about who defined what art was, it was always men. And I'm just not interested in these male definitions of art. To me, I'm more interested in female subjectivity, let's say. And I think sometimes if you were to look at a fabric, or that has come through a loom, then what is that subjectivity? If there was a piece of embroidery that was done by your grandmother, what was your grandmother thinking when she was making this embroidery, which we will never be able to access? So I think I'm interested in recovering female subjectivity through a feminist lens. I'm not even interested. I think it's so boring, this question of like, what is art, like, and then I think that can be another form of gatekeeping. I'm interested in saying, let's open this up, let's make it as expansive. Let's say my grandmother was an artist, who are you to say she wasn't? So I think that's sometimes a way to be like totally radical and anti-establishment, and to really let the fringes kind of implode the mainstream.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know that you have to leave in about 10 minutes, right? So we can maybe then keep on going. So
it's important.
Yeah, let's keep this 10 minutes maybe where we can still discuss while Rosalyn is there. Are there already comments or questions from the audience here or online? You can type them in the chat as well. I think we're monitoring this. some remarks or questions for Rosalyn at this point? No.
And if there's no question, then I have a question for Nina.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. I'm actually very curious to know what is your process in terms of research? Like, how do you undertake? Because so many of your pieces, and I'm not a native German speaker. I've only been learning it over the last 2-3 years. So I'm slow with reading a lot of them, but you do a lot of, it looks like you read a lot, you research a lot, and then you start to put together. Is it, how do you decide, okay, this is the artist I'm going to write about? And then what is your process like? How long do you take to write your pieces?
Yeah, it's quite, it doesn't really have a plan because, when I see something which kind of interests me or gets me, or if I'm getting upset because, for example, I'm reading an interview with Marina Abramovic, who says you can't be a mother and an artist, which is actually motherhood your issue now, then when I have time, because actually, as Klaus said, I have so many different jobs. When I have time and I'm upset enough or I'm interested enough in it, then I'm kind of doing some research on this certain issue and regular way, sometimes going to libraries, or recently I was very delighted to see work by Margaret MacDonald McIntosh, who looked like a bit like a kind of forerunner of Gustav Klimt and his Beethoven frieze. And I didn't know that. It was in a show at the Belvedere. And so then I delved into this artist by reading some books and so on. So I think for me, this blog is kind of leisure time project, but I think it's important to have a good basis. I mean, it's not just like, but it's the same in your case, because it's not just like I'm writing something which comes to my mind and that's it, because it wouldn't be it wouldn't be serious enough, I think. So but I think that's the same in your case. I mean, you're doing another kind of, your research maybe in another way, but you also have a very deep knowledge on what you're writing about.
Yeah, sometimes I worry because I do so many different kinds of work. Like I have now a full-time job where I work as an editor with the foundation in another country. So my work hours are like, I work 4 to 5 hours in the morning while my partner has our kid. And then after that, I'm with my kid. And then I put him to sleep. And then I have a little bit of time in the evening to read or, just relax. And then once a month, I have to write my column. So I'm kind of just thinking about it all the time. Okay, I'm going to write about this. And then I have to I kind of like you research it in whatever time I have and I'm able to find. So it's kind of something that's always going on at the back of my mind. And also I found after motherhood, I had to tell myself, go easy. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be meticulously detailed. It can also be an opinion that you leave out there for someone else to pick up on and do something more with it. It can also also be 3 paragraphs. And I think that's why I like the form of a column, because like a blog, it kind of, you have the freedom to take it in whatever direction you want to, and you don't feel like you're answerable to anyone else. I think that kind of sense of, you have a personal responsibility, and I think you have authorship. And I think that's really, I really enjoy that autonomy. I think for a while, I tried to pitch columns to a place and then to another magazine, and it was so exhausting, the process. First of all, the editors don't get back to you unless they know you or someone has recommended you. And then they start to define the parameters of what you should write. And I just found the whole process so tedious that I thought, okay, this column is so much better, because I just have to tell them, okay, this month I'm going to be writing on this show, so that there's no clash. And then I have the freedom to kind of explore that subject. And that's really, it's exciting, and it feels like a luxury to have that, to have that space and then to claim it.
So what's interesting, because you in the beginning you said it took you a while to find your own voice, and I think maybe the column is the place to
explore
for your own voice, or maybe even to develop it further, or I don't know how you.
Yeah, I actually wrote a traditional review after a very long time. It's in the June issue of Camera Austria, because I reviewed this rosemary chocolate show in Frankfurt at the MMK. And for me, it was one of the reasons why I wanted to travel to Frankfurt. So and I suddenly felt like, oh my God, I'm actually writing a review, and it was really limited number of characters. And it was exciting to exercise that muscle again. To kind of remove myself and not get into like, I felt this way or my body felt this way, which is what my column allows me to do, and to be more in this format of, the sort of professional review. I enjoyed it, but it felt like a different form, from what I have been acclimatized to. Yeah.
But doesn't affect the column your other writing? So
no, I think I'm able to switch between registers, because like I have my own personal writing that I do, which is like my writing practice. And then there's my art writing, which is like, and then I have my weekly columns. I have this feminist column for a newspaper back home, which has a different kind of tonal register. So I actually have different registers in which I write. And they're all kind of a bit individual in a certain way. It's a bit different, let's say. Like right now, I can even show you, because I have it in front of me. I'm writing my next book, and it looks like this, because I write on these flashcards, and I just write with my ink pen whenever I find time, and then I kind of I have these chapters that are created like this, and this entire book is just like this. It's just handwritten, and when I find time, I kind of transcribe then each chapter on the computer, so it's on another storage system. But this book, which is my book, is being written entirely like this. I wouldn't write my art criticism like this. And the reason I'm doing this book like this is because in my own writing, I want to get away from over-researching. I want to get away from overly citing other people in order to really get closer and closer to my personal self. So it's it's a different kind of modality, let's say.
Can I ask one? Maybe it's a big question, but I think it's important. So there are feminist themes, of course, but is there a feminist style of writing, would you say? Because you were speaking about different ways of writing. Are you looking for?
I really think feminism is, for me, I really think that it's a way of looking, and it's, for me, an intersectional approach rather than a style. I think stylistically, there's so many ways in which you can approach feminist writing and feminist art. So I think for me, it's very much about a way of looking, and it's what Sarah Emmett calls, being a killjoy, constantly poking the patriarchy, and saying, this is the problem, and kind of really channeling your rage, like she said, Nina said, this feeling upset, this rage, and just being like, how do I kind of transform this and do something with it instead of just like letting it out as a ragey cry, how do I kind of morph it into something? Yeah.
So you wouldn't say when you said, you would say my body feels this way, or that there's a kind of synchronization between what you're writing and the way you're expressing that kind of thinking. I mean, also when you spoke about the motherhood and umbilical as opposed to the seminal and so on. I mean, for me, I had this intuition that maybe there was some kind of correspondence between this style and a certain way and the certain topics and the topics you're treating, but maybe it's a
I think my personal explorations of this subject come through like third world feminist literature, which is about generating theory through lived experience, something that Audre Lorde does or bell hooks does, and how that comes into art criticism. And I think that's why I think so much of traditional art reviews tell you to remove your body from it. You're not supposed to necessarily use the eye. You're supposed to have this distance. And I really feel like all of this is actually coming from like male pedagogical discourse, which I try to kind of mitigate. But then I feel in my Rosemary Trucker review, I was able to go beyond talking about her hearth paintings as just kitchen, and thinking about it more in terms of form and structure. And so I think even if I wrote differently, that review, it was still very much a feminist approach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
On that note, I'm going to have to go now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Rosalyn.
Yeah, Nina, I would love to meet you.
Let's keep in touch.
Person. And if you come by Südtirol or when I'm in Vienna next, I would love to meet you.
Yeah, it was so nice talking to you now.
Yeah, no, for me, it was really exciting. I've been reading through your blog the last couple of days. I mean, it takes me a really long time because the language is so sophisticated and my German is not that high at that level yet, but I'm really enjoying it. And it's exciting because it's motivating for me to read more in German.
So when you are in Vienna one day, just
definitely it's a date.
Amazing. I was hoping that this would happen at the end of the season.
I'm sorry.
Mission accomplished. Maybe you can find a way, because I was also thinking, you do the feminist critique, you say, okay, I do it in my free time. You say, I have this day job, and I think during my day job about my column. And I was nearly like, is there no full-time position for feminist critique? But that's maybe another big question, right? Does it have to be marginal, or okay. So maybe that's the project.
Thanks for connecting us, Klaus.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. Thank you so much, Nina, and thank you so much, Klaus. Yeah, a big kiss to Alma.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Can we allow ourselves to switch to German? You said you would be happy to.
I mean,
if the audience is, sprechen alle Deutsch.
Fine with both of it, if there is somebody.
Dann können wir vielleicht auch in der Sprache, in der du schreibst, ja. Ist das auch okay online, oder wenn wir jetzt auf Deutsch ein bisschen weitersprechen? Ja, super. Weil dann können wir in der Sprache sprechen, in der du auch schreibst.
Muttersprache ist.
Muttersprache.
Muttersprache, wenn schon so wie die Rede von den Müttern war.
Absolut, ja. Ja, gibt es von eurer Seite noch Fragen an Nina? Wir haben jetzt zuerst mal über Rosalyn und mit Rosalyn auch gesprochen.
Ich hätte eine Frage. Wie forschst du die Themen? Also wenn du über eine Ausstellung schreibst, redest du mit den Autorinnen oder mit den anderen Mitarbeitern im Museum? um herauszufinden, dass, also, wie die Struktur ist. Und, ja.
Ja, also es kommt ganz darauf an, was für ein Artikel das ist. Also üblicherweise schon, aber ich schreibe ja für viele verschiedene Medien. Es ist manchmal auch so, dass ich irgendwie Porträts schreibe über Künstler, Künstlerinnen oder ja, einfach klassische Reviews, was allerdings eigentlich wenig ist. Also das mache ich dann für Profil ab und zu, so ganz kurze Texte. Also üblicherweise spreche ich da schon mit jemandem. Ja, aber wenn zum Beispiel, also das letzte, was ich jetzt auf meinem Blog geschrieben habe, das war eigentlich, was ich gerade vorher erzählt habe, diese Geschichte mit der Künstlerin Margaret MacDonald McIntosh, da war quasi diese Ausstellung so der Anlasspunkt, aber da ging es eigentlich nicht unbedingt um diese Ausstellung, sondern um eben diese quasi Vorläuferinnenschaft zu Klimt, und dann mache ich das anders. Aber an sich, also wobei ich auch sagen muss, dass ich dann auch schon manchmal so ein bisschen gespalten bin, soll man das machen oder nicht, weil ich meine, die Leute, die ich kenne, die zum Beispiel über Film schreiben oder über Theater, die gehen in die Vorführung oder ja, Pressevorführung und schreiben dann ihren Text. Das heißt, die sind eigentlich dann ziemlich quasi unbearbeitet. Und in der Kunstkritik ist es eigentlich schon eher üblicher, dass man dann mit KuratorInnen, KünstlerInnen sich die Kunst anschaut, was vielleicht auch damit zu tun hat, dass die Kunst halt schon häufig viel kommentarbedürftiger ist. Aber man muss halt dann auch aufpassen, dass man nicht dem Stockholm-Syndrom erliegt. Also vor lauter Sympathie für die Personen dann halt das zu positiv oder durch die rosa Brille sieht, sagen wir so. Kann ich das aus?
Ach so, nein, das wird gestreamt auch.
Ja, schon, aber also die Kamera ist da.
So, nee, das
Ja, okay. Das nervt mich nämlich ein bisschen.
wenn ich immer selber ist, ja, das stimmt. Ja, aha. Andere Fragen. Also es ist, glaube ich, auch so eine Glaubenssache zum Teil, ob man das macht. Und die Institutionen wollen das ja immer, drängen es einem, also bieten es einem immer an. Ich würde fast sagen, drängen es einem auf, weil sie wissen, also vielleicht spekuliert man ja auch damit, wenn du die Leute getroffen hast. Erstens verstehst du es besser, aber zweitens, natürlich hast du dann auch eher einen positiven Blick auf die Dinge. Und ja.
Aber ich finde, man muss trotzdem dann auch immer wieder davon ausgehen, also auch wenn man das alles erklärt kriegt, man kann ja nicht davon ausgehen, dass ein Publikum sich das auch mit Führung anschaut. Also man muss eigentlich schon davon ausgehen, also auch quasi auf dieser vermittlerischen Ebene, was ist, wenn jemand ohne irgendwie Begleitung reinkommt. Und dann ist halt schon auch oft die Frage, also KuratorInnen haben sehr viel zu erzählen und das ist auch interessant, sehr oft, aber es nimmt dann manchmal auch so ein bisschen die Zeit, die man dann für die Kunst selber, oder ich meine, ich habe es halt schon sehr gern, wenn ich dann so rein kippen kann, also wenn, ja, also ich habe es für mich nicht definitiv so beantwortet.
Ich auch nicht, aber das ist ein interessanter Punkt, dass du so dieses begleitete Schauen, nenne ich es jetzt mal, da hast du natürlich nicht die gleiche Erfahrung. Und du hast ja manchmal, hast du vielleicht 1-2 Stunden Zeit und entweder hast du dann die 1-2 Stunden dich selber mit der Kunst auseinandergesetzt und deine Erfahrung gemacht oder begleitet.
Ja.
Und wenn es begleitet war, manchmal habe ich schon auch das Gefühl gehabt, ich habe jetzt irgendwie die Kunst verpasst, weil ich so viel Diskurs dazu bekommen habe.
Ja.
Das ist sogar auch noch ein Thema, das hatte ich jetzt gar nicht gedacht.
Und wie gesagt, ich mache nicht so viel so Ausstellungskritiken eigentlich, aber also so dieses klassische Review-Thema, aber eben, also ich sehe das schon sehr stark auch so von so einer Ebene von quasi, ich bin jetzt eigentlich auch nicht mehr als irgendwie eine vielleicht etwas besser informierte oder grundierte oder imprägnierte Durchschnittsbesucherin. Also vielleicht habe ich ein paar Ausstellungen mehr gesehen als jemand, der oder dieser sonst reingeht, aber ja, wirklich.
Und wie ist es, ich meine, die Rosalyn hat so gesagt, ja, ich will kein People-Pleasing Art Criticism machen. Also nicht jetzt was Gefälliges schreiben. Das ist ja inzwischen tatsächlich nicht nur in Indien selten, sondern es ist ja auch bei uns selten, dass Leute, also sagen wir mal, eine kritische Kritik schreiben. Und ich habe auch viele Kolleginnen, die sagen, ja, das bringt ja sowieso nichts. Erstens beschäftigst du dich mit was, das dir nicht gefällt, lange, weil du den Text schreibst. Dann machst du dir viele Feinde, so, und die schreiben dann nicht, wenn es ihnen nicht gefällt. So. Und das ist in Frankreich so, das ist auch hier so. Ich persönlich habe immer versucht, mir das zu bewahren. Ich mag es auch dann, auch mal was Kritisches oder einen Text zu schreiben über Dinge, die ich nicht mag. Aber natürlich kann es dir schon passieren, dass du es dir mit Leuten auch verdirbst. Und ich habe immer die Hoffnung, dass dann am Ende sagen die Leute, ja, wenn er was Gutes denkt, dann schreibt er was Gutes. Und wenn er was Kritisches denkt, dann schreibt er was Kritisches. Und man respektiert es. Aber wie ist denn das bei dir? Also
naja, ich meine, das kommt halt drauf an, was es ist. Also ich würde jetzt nicht hingehen und eine junge Künstlerin, die gerade mit der Kunstakademie fertig geworden ist, irgendwas macht, wo ich mir denke, ja, ich meine, bitte.
Da brauchst du kein Verriss schreiben.
Das haben wir jetzt schon durch. Das finde ich unfair.
Ja, finde ich.
Ja, aber ich finde, man kann, wenn man was für überschätzt hält oder so, finde ich das schon gut, wenn man das auch dann kundtut. Allerdings, in meinem Fall, ich habe halt so viele verschiedene also Auftraggeberinnen, so viele verschiedene Medien. Und ich meine, was ich lange Zeit hauptsächlich gemacht habe, Profil, ein Wochenmagazin, wo man halt jede Woche irgendwas über Kunst eigentlich schreiben konnte. Das ist jetzt, also das hat sich einfach auch verändert bei mir, weil ich nicht mehr sehr viel dafür schreibe, weil das einfach aufgrund dieser ganzen ohnehin bekannten also Umwälzungen in der Medienbranche nicht mehr geht in der Form. Das war so eher der Platz für solche Sachen, ja. Und also diese wirklich also sehr kritische Auseinandersetzung mit Phänomenen oder ja, vielleicht auch überbewerteten Stars oder sowas, die führe ich dann eher auf meinem Blog halt durch. So.
Ja, es ist ja auch so, das wird auch oft nicht angenommen. Also wenn du es vorschlägst, mir ist auch schon passiert, dass die Leute dann gesagt haben, nee, also ich habe gesagt, ich habe da nichts Gutes dazu zu sagen, aber ich schreibe es gerne. Und dann wird es abgelehnt und dann sieht man irgendwie 3 Monate lang einen Werbebanner auf der Website für die Ausstellung. Weißt du, also das ist natürlich
das sind dann so eher die Fachmedien, aber bei diesen Tages- und Wochenmagazinen ist es meiner Erfahrung nach eigentlich das Gegenteil der Fall. Also je kritischer oder Verriss, ich meine, wie gesagt, also so diese klassischen Reviews, das ist in Wochenmagazinen findet wenig Platz, weil das einfach nicht das richtige Medium dafür ist, weil das natürlich in den Tageszeitungen dann vorher schon erschienen ist und so weiter, aber da ist es eigentlich schon eher so, dass je kritischer, desto besser, weil, also, ja.
Macht den Lesern mehr Spaß.
Ja, und wie gesagt, also, das vielleicht auch je mehr man eine eigene Sicht finden kann, desto besser, aber ja, wie gesagt, also diese ganze Branche ist sehr im Umbruch und also diese klassische Art von Kunstkritik, wo man sagt, ja, ich gehe, weiß nicht, 2-3 Mal in der Woche in eine Ausstellung und schaue es mir an. Also da gibt es halt mittlerweile in ganz Österreich, glaube ich, nur mehr, also die Leute, die das machen und davon leben können, lassen sich wahrscheinlich an 2 Händen abzählen. Also das, ja.
Weitere Fragen oder Anmerkungen? Ich kann nochmal einen Punkt auf, den Rosalyn erwähnt hat, den ich euch auch gerne beide fragen wollte, wo sie hat ja viele auch, sagen wir mal so, Theoriekonzepte natürlich sind sehr wichtig für sie, die sie dann auch selber entwickelt und so, und hat dann aber gesagt, sie hat lange gebraucht, um dann die Praxis dazu zu finden. Also eine feministische Praxis. Ist das was du auch suchst oder sagst? Also kannst du mit dem Begriff irgendwas anfangen, über jetzt das Schreiben hinaus?
Naja, ich meine, eine feministische Praxis, also über das Schreiben hinaus, ich meine, jemand, der sich dafür interessiert, wird sich im gesamten Leben dafür interessieren oder wird das natürlich im gesamten Leben irgendwie, ja, verfolgen oder so. Also ich meine, ich bin die Erste, die demnächst wahrscheinlich irgendwann bei der Demo ist dafür, dass man bitte das Recht auf körperliche Selbstbestimmung beibehalten muss, weil das sind, ich meine, wir sehen ja, was rundherum passiert auf der Welt und auch in unserem Land, wo man sieht, es gibt plötzlich Herdprämien in Salzburg, es gibt die Empfehlung, Kinder adoptieren zu lassen, weil man eben gegen Abtreibung, also weil man das alles wieder in Wirklichkeit, ja, zurückdrängen möchte und alle Selbstbestimmungsrechte von Frauen. Also das regt mich wahnsinnig auf, und wenn da mal irgendwas passiert, bin ich natürlich dabei. Also ich finde, das eine geht ohne dem anderen nicht. Also genauso wie man natürlich auch versucht, andere Frauen, die halt, keine Ahnung, gerade, weiß nicht, denen ihr Mann, ihr Ex zu wenig Alimente zahlt, versucht, denen zu sagen, jetzt hau mal auf den Tisch, also dir steht das Doppelte zu und mach das jetzt. Also ich finde, man kann jetzt nicht nur sagen, okay, ich mache das jetzt in meiner Arbeit oder in meinem Schreiben, weil das ist ja was, man würde ja das eine ohne dem anderen nicht machen. So. Ja, und ich meine, es gibt auch, finde ich, so eine ganz gute, also irgendwo, mir das mal gedacht, ja, es ist ganz gut, wenn man selber mal dann irgendwie praktisch in der Verantwortung ist, was zu tun, dann ist es halt natürlich schon wichtig, auch die Ressourcen, die man zur Verfügung hat, entsprechend zu verteilen. Also dass man dann eben natürlich schaut, dass man, also ich mache dieses Kulturmagazin, dass man dann natürlich dann schaut, dass man mehr Künstlerinnen da drinnen abbildet, dass man Fotografinnen engagiert, Autorinnen und so weiter. Ich meine, was mich doch immer wieder zuversichtlich stimmt, ist, man kann schon einfach einen Unterschied machen. Also das ist, man kann, wenn man da, also quasi als Spaß- und Freizeitprojekt, das man halt macht, weil es einer liegt, wenn man dann da zum Beispiel über Künstlerinnen schreibt, die vorher jemand nicht kannte und die dann kennenlernt, dann hat man irgendwie schon einen kleinen Erfolg errungen, wenn man sich beklagt darüber, dass irgendwie jetzt schon wieder ein weißer Mann im Kunsthistorischen Museum in der Schiene für zeitgenössische Kunst ausstellt und dann jemand draufkommt, hoppala, das ist ja wirklich so interessant, da war noch nie eine Frau. Wenn dann jemand draufkommt und das ein bisschen zu sickern beginnt, dann bin ich schon glücklich. Also da denke ich mir, ja, man kann doch, also man muss nicht verzagen, obwohl alles rundherum irgendwie oft so schwierig ausschaut. und Backlash droht und so weiter. Ja, also.
Ich würde fast sagen, und das ist eigentlich ein gutes Schlusswort, dass wir nicht verzagen, außer es gibt doch noch dringende weitere Fragen oder Anmerkungen für Nina. Ansonsten bleibt mir mich zu bedanken beim Depot wieder, bei euch allen für eure Anwesenheit, bei dir vor allem, dass du es geschafft hast, zu unserem Crit Cross auch persönlich zu kommen.
Danke für die hartnäckige Einladung.
Ja,
Es war schön.
Immer wieder nach einem Termin gesucht.
Ja, genau.
Ja, ich hoffe, dir hat es auch Freude gemacht.
Ja, total. Vielen Dank für die Einladung. Gut. So.